Hey guys, thanks for joining in with me. I just want to do a quick follow-up to a video that I had watched from XJW Elder's Wife's channel. She read recently from the June 15th, 1962 Watchtower entitled, Avoid Unprofitable Questions. And it's interesting how Watchtower will take two words, three words from a Bible scripture and formulate an entire dialogue that really makes them look foolish in themselves. I want to read part of what she wrote from this, what she read from part of this article. First paragraph down towards the bottom. Elsewhere, the apostle cautions Christians to avoid philosophy and empty deception, idle talk, empty speeches, falsely called knowledge, false stories, and strange teachings. That prompted me to think about something that ex-Jehovah's Witnesses talk a lot about, and I'm going to get to that in just a moment. Please allow me to read parts of two paragraphs. On page 382, right-hand column, I'll be reading from this section, about half of the paragraph. Because it's really an eye-opener when you think about how the Jehovah's Witnesses, especially, the faithful and discreet slave, think that they've got everything figured out. And everything that they've figured out cannot possibly be philosophy and empty deception, cannot possibly be idle talk, cannot possibly be empty speeches or falsely called knowledge, false stories, and strange teaching. See, everything that comes out of the mouth of the faithful and discreet slave doesn't fit that description from Paul. I want to read that part of that paragraph. Accurate knowledge, now keep in mind, accurate knowledge and full discernment of the important matters vital to your salvation are constantly brought to your attention by Jehovah's faithful and discreet slave, whom his master appointed over his domestics to give them their food at the proper time. Each issue of the Watchtower and Awake magazines contain rich food for your building up in faith and love. Not going to go on with the rest of it because it's the same old propaganda. Now remember, accurate knowledge and full discernment. Each issue of the Watchtower and Awake. There's no way with accurate knowledge and full discernment. There's no way that each Watchtower and Awake magazine could ever have philosophy and empty deception, idle talk, empty speeches, falsely called knowledge, false stories, and strange teachings. Because after all, the information that's in the Watchtower and Awake magazine is life-saving information. The last paragraph. Let us make the wisest use of our time then, avoiding unprofitable questions and always remembering Paul's counsel. Learn the rule. Do not go beyond the things written. It's interesting after having read this that you can reflect back on what happened to Flodine in that convention talk where they had to cut part of it out. The John chapter 5, 28, 29, where Jesus talked about the resurrection. Watchtower, was that empty deception? Was that philosophy? Was that idle talk? Was that an empty speech? Was that falsely called knowledge? A false story? Was that a strange teaching? I mean, if it doesn't fit that category, then there'd been no reason to cut that out of Flodine's talk. But you cut it out. But friends, there's something even more deeper in this that like I said, I have not heard ex-Jehovah's Witnesses talk about it. But we all have talked about the generation of 1914 will not pass away until all these things occur, including the start of the Great Tribulation. Hey, Watchtower, because that fell flat on its face and that generation is dead and gone in your overlapping generation, is that now philosophy and empty deception? Is that just idle talk? Is that an empty speech? Is that falsely called knowledge? Is that a false story? Or is that a strange teaching? But there's something we all forget, friends. Going back to that 1914 generation nonsense, and I didn't take the time to go find an article because every ex-Jehovah's Witness on the other side of this camera knows for a fact that Watchtower teaches that the heavenly resurrection began in when? 1918? 1919. See, that's when Jesus started gathering all of the anointed that were resting and asleep in their graves. And that's all tied with the generation of 1914. Isn't it, Watchtower? You see, accurate knowledge and full discernment are of the important matters vital to your salvation. They're constantly brought to your attention by Jehovah's faithful and discreet slave, whom their master appointed over his domestics, to give them their food at the proper time. Each issue of the Watchtower and Awake. You've got hundreds of articles that you printed about that resurrection in books, showing that that resurrection of the anointed began in 1918, 1919, and it all hinged on the generation of 1914. So since that generation is gone, Watchtower, I can't help but read an article like this and see that with that 1914 generation and the resurrection, the starting of the resurrection of the anointed began 1918, 1919, that you yourselves have not avoided philosophy and empty deception. You have not avoided idle talk. You have not avoided empty speeches. Certainly have not avoided falsely called knowledge, otherwise you wouldn't have to do an overlapping generation, because it fell flat on its face. That generation went and fell flat on its face, and so did that heavenly resurrection. Didn't happen because they're both tied together, aren't they, Watchtower? See, you have false stories and you have strange teachings. It's no different than the Apostle Paul condemning those back in his day that said, oh, the resurrection already happened, the resurrection already happened. You come down here and you tie that heavenly resurrection with the 1914 generation. The generation is dead and gone, and so is your heavenly resurrection. Have a nice day.